space in Lower Manhattan. The city had no option but to sell more bonds to Wall Street, and Wall Street was tired of buying them. John played an absolutely pivotal role in convincing people with his quiet and intelligent confidence and manner to bring the city back. And I think, history will tell how he played an enormous role among many, but an enormous role in saving the city during that incredibly perilous time. And now fast forward the clock 25 years later, after 9/11, he was the person who steadfastly defended our ability to stick by Lower Manhattan, to bring the city back from what had happened. And candidly, the results that came from all of that were in no small part because of John's unwillingness to give up at a time when most people were seriously considering that. All of those are things that are a part of his legacy of optimism and perseverance, even when there's facts that might have you think otherwise. Second thing that John always taught me was the need to sort of reconsider the relationship between the public and private sector. I've always thought it's important for us in the 21st century to redefine the relationship between the public and private sector, because their cooperation among themselves is absolutely critical to taking on the challenges that we have. John obviously did that through his work at Brookfield and the various charitable entities he was involved in, and I think we've all benefited from it. And Howard Milstein, who preceded me here on the podium, the Millstream Forum at RPA was all about getting private sector leaders and public sector leaders in a room to talk to each other about finding common sense solutions to problems, as opposed to basically finger pointing at each other. And I think that that's the kind of leadership, Howard, that we're grateful to you for, because you're bringing to this city and bringing to this discussion. I think it's safe to say in some ways that not everybody heard John's message. We still have a tendency to sort of try to point fingers at each other and blame people for different things. It's always a lot easier to be critical of something than it is to contribute and do something about it. John's legacy is one that taught us to do the exact opposite. And I think that's the lesson today as we look at crumbling infrastructure, when we look at all the things that need to get done. I think it's important for us to sort of stop and consider the fact that the ability to work together, the ability to fashion solutions that represent reasonable compromises will go a long, long way toward us tackling a long list of things that we have unfortunately for too long ignored. And certainly in the infrastructure space, that's very, very true. There are things that I focus on because of my area of responsibility, but there are many things that we need to sort of get to. And the sooner we start getting to them in a thoughtful, intelligent way, where we're actually trying to make each other succeed, the greater chance there is that we'll actually accomplish those things. And these are all things that, clearly are right out of the John Zuccotti lesson book. You've heard a lot of discussion, and we're grateful that our message on Gateway has become the RPA message as well. In fact, I'm not sure which preceded which, and I'm looking at Tom, so I'm being respectful of the fact that it is a really good idea, and we don't own it at Amtrak, and RPA doesn't own it at RPA, but we all own it together. And that is a perfect example of where we really need to come together. You've heard lots of statistics about why we need to why we need to rebuild our Trans-Hudson capacity, about the 200,000 people a day who cross the tunnel cross into New York City through those tunnels, about Penn Station being built for 200,000 people, but now having 3 times that go through it. You've heard about the impact on the economy, the fact that 20% of the population, 17% of the population of the United States lives somewhere within the Northeast Corridor, and 20% of the GDP is generated from the Northeast Corridor in the regions that surround it. You've heard all of that, but let me tell you one thing about Gateway and why it's important that goes beyond Gateway itself. Gateway will prove to ourselves and to the world that we can do big things. The very fact that we're taking on this project and our ability to succeed will convince the world that we have that ability, that we're not looking at ourselves and taking our greatness and allowing some sense of defeatism to be as if we turned an hourglass over, and when the sand comes out of the hourglass, some other city or some other region or some other country will be the place that everyone wants to be. We can't let that happen, and we have to be the people who represent the willingness and the stamina to do that. And by building Gateway, we will prove to the world that we can actually do these things. All the things that are viewed as being impediments to getting this done, the ability to work across political and jurisdictional lines, financial creativity, a better relationship with the private sector, engineering solutions, all of these are things that we're going to have to master if we're going to do anything. So these are all skill sets that we have to build, and skill sets that we think success in the Gateway program will bring us to that. So everybody reads the newspapers and everyone knows that there's lots of arguing and lots of fighting going on, and certainly no one can stand here and tell you that, you know, this project has come to a point where it is in complete consensus among all. There's lots of differing opinions, but there is not a difference of opinion about the fact that we need to do it. So why am I optimistic? Well, I'm optimistic about where we are for a couple of reasons. The first reason I'm optimistic is because this region has been through tough times before. We did come out of the financial crisis in the 1970s. We did rebuild Lower Manhattan after it was taken away from us by a violent act by very courageous people who stood up and did exactly what they needed to do to rebuild not just this city, but the heart and soul of what this region is about. We did get through those things, and we will get through this as well. Secondly, our leadership, and I will confess to being an optimist, our leadership actually does get it. I think Governor Cuomo, Governor Murphy, the entire congressional delegation, certainly Senator Schumer, Mayor de Blasio, they do understand the critical nature of this project. They have become complete supporters, and I know they will step up and have stepped up in order to make it a reality. Thirdly is all the people who we live and work with. New Yorkers and people in the region have gotten fed up with the inadequacy of the transportation system that they rely on. When I read a story about how people are upset about problems in the trains or some other issue, it doesn't bother me. I actually think that is the fuel that will ignite the kind of support that's necessary in order to get these things done. New Yorkers, people in this region will not put up with that inadequacy. And that is actually a reason why I am optimistic that this will happen. And finally, I see the partnerships that come together. Kathy Wild's here from the Partnership for New York City. There are many groups like that, and certainly the RPA in its 4th regional plan has created a dialogue around which we can all come together and agree on things that need to be done, creating a level of order and priority, and bringing the kind of skill sets together that will make all that happen. So for all that reasons, despite everything that might give you reasons to sort of pause, I'm going to take a playbook from my mentor and friend, John Zuccotti, and I'm going to stick with it, and hopefully all of you will as well. Thank you for this honor.
To everyone's attention, thank you. I have the great honor this afternoon to introduce Secretary Hillary Clinton, a woman whose life has been so well documented that she doesn't need much of an introduction. And we've all been here for a long program, so I'm going to skip my formal introductions. I just want to focus on two things related to Secretary Clinton. One is when Secretary Clinton was Senator Clinton, our senator of the great state of New York, and what she did for our state when she was in the Senate. Two things that come to mind for me specifically. One was right after 9/11 when she went and toured the Trade Center site with Mayor Giuliani, and she came out with incredible conviction that she was going to do whatever it took to make sure that New York got all the help it got to rebuild. She, along with Senator Schumer, were actually to be able to bring $20 billion to New York, and she made sure that we rebuilt the World Trade Center site bigger and better than before. But Hillary Clinton's a fighter, and she's incredibly compassionate. So it wasn't that part that was only most impressive, but she recognized that the many first responders and workers on that site were ill after that. And so then she went to fight to make sure that they actually got the funding to support them as they had to recover, or their families, for those that were unfortunately unable to recover, for being the first responders and those that helped rebuild the Trade Center and made sure she brought it back for New York. She always fought for New York on infrastructure. And there was never a question, you listen to Tony with his discussion, when it came to understanding the importance of the infrastructure for New York, and particularly the Gateway Tunnel, Secretary Clinton, or Senator Clinton at the time, knew how it was going to get done and made sure she brought it back for New York. Personal story, though, that really I think is a different understanding of Senator Clinton than many of us have, which is a colleague of mine that many of you know was a staffer for Senator Clinton. And in 2008, he had his first child. And the child fell into some health issues and was in NICU fighting for his life. And while Senator Clinton was actually on the campaign trail, while he was in NICU, she called and said, "How's he doing? I'm here for you." And so it's the level of compassion. That same staffer, about 5 years later, Senator Clinton again on the campaign trail, or maybe 6 years later, the mother of that child was in Mali, Africa, and there was a terrorist attack at a hotel. 20 people were killed, and there was one American woman killed, which was Anita Dakar, which is my staffer's former wife and the mother of his child. It was a very, very, obviously you could imagine, dramatic day, painful day. And at 10 o'clock that night, as the day was coming to the close, the phone rang, and it was Secretary Clinton checking on him and saying, "I'm here for you." So not only is she a fighter, she's one of the most compassionate women that's out there, who's here for our country, our state, her friends, her family, her colleagues, and does whatever it takes to try to make a difference and do the right thing for people when they're in need. No further ado, let me introduce Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all. Thank you. I'm very, very happy to be here with all of you for such a meaningful conference. And I want to thank Scott for that introduction and for his work on behalf of these issues. I want to thank RPA President Tom Wright. I want to thank Rit Agarwala, the chair of the 4th Regional Plan. And I have to say, I looked forward to the 4th Regional Plan the way some people look forward to the next Marvel movie. And it did not disappoint. It has been a very productive 4 years since the last plan. And I think anyone interested in the economic growth and the prosperity, the positive future for this region would do well to pay a lot of attention to this latest plan. I was delighted to see my friend, Governor Phil Murphy, earlier when I was coming in and he was leaving. I had the privilege of working with him when he was our ambassador to Germany and I was Secretary of State. And I'm excited by the great start he's laid down in his governorship. And I'm delighted that you chose to honor Tony Kosha for his extraordinary work at Amtrak. So all together, this has been, I think, a terrific gathering. And I just wanted to add my thoughts to what you've already been considering, because I don't think you can talk about infrastructure too much. I think it has to be, right up there with social media issues of other kinds. And so I know that RPA is about more than trains, tunnels, and zoning rules. In fact, I tweeted just before coming out here, hooray for infrastructure, because we talked a lot about it during the last campaign, but we still haven't delivered on it. And what I like about the RPA and about this fourth regional plan is that you've taken your time to talk with people from all walks of life, to understand the challenges that they were facing. And one of the things you heard, which is important in the context of our economy and certainly of how we're going to build an inclusive, successful growth plan going forward, is how hard it is for too many to even get on that first rung to climb the ladder of success. Housing is too expensive for too many people. Commutes are too long and unreliable for too many people. The challenge of climate change poses a threat to people's livelihoods and even their lives, especially for those of us living in this region near the coast and waterways. And perhaps the most alarming thing you heard was that a lot of people have lost confidence. They think some of these problems may simply be unsolvable. Well, I disagree. As a Secretary of State who traveled to 112 countries on behalf of our country, as a U.S. Senator from New York, as someone who went to school and met my husband in New Haven, as someone who's had the pleasure of calling this region home, I think that we can show once again that problems are solvable by bringing people together to listen to one another, come up with ideas, test those ideas in the real world, and get about the business of moving forward together. And here in the tri-state region, our economy in general is thriving. New York is the most diverse city in the country, one of the safest. In fact, we live in one of the most diverse regions anywhere in America or the world, a place where people from around the globe want to visit, live, and work. Regions like ours hold the answer to some of the biggest and most urgent challenges we're facing. Challenges like how to achieve greater equity and affordability, how to build resilient infrastructure, how to do these things in a sustainable, affordable way. And the cities in our region aren't just competing with other cities in the United States. You know that so well. We are competing with the most innovative, forward-thinking cities in the world. A city like Singapore, which is implementing plans to become a smart nation. Like London, which has modernized its subway signals and added new underground, overground commuter and bus lines. Like Toronto, which is combining urban design and advanced technology to improve quality of life. And as the people in this room probably know better than anyone, if we don't make these investments now, others will, and we will fall behind. A lot of attention has been devoted in recent years to the challenges caused by a diverse society and a globalized economy. And we should admit there are real challenges. Sometimes, though, it's hard to separate legitimate concerns from resentment and fear. But I believe that America's diversity, our connections to the wider world, aren't weaknesses. They're some of our greatest competitive advantages. They enable us to take advantage of innovation and opportunities in real time. So yes, there are some trying times that we are in the midst of. Between an administration that seems more focused on tweeting than making policy and a gridlocked Congress, it's no wonder that too many people are feeling discouraged. And so instead of making the long overdue investments we need, we see this current administration in Washington taking us in the wrong direction by cutting money from public housing programs like NYCHA. And let's face it, the recent federal tax bill was a direct attack on this region. And we have a Secretary of Housing and Urban Development who recently said we should raise rent, maybe as high as tripling rent, for families who are struggling to get by. Tripling rent for the poorest households in our country. So this is bigger than politics. It certainly is bigger than partisanship. It's about our fundamental values. Because now more than ever, we cannot afford to give up on big ideas that can't wait. And I want to talk about just a few of those ideas, ideas that I think will help us bring opportunity and increase equity to every corner of our region, that will make us healthier, safer, richer, and more resilient in the face of all these challenges. So let me start with one of the biggest ideas that can't wait. We do need to build an economy that works for everyone, not just those of us at the top. Income inequality is greater in our region than anywhere else in the country. For the bottom 3/5 of households, incomes have stagnated since 2000, yet housing costs have skyrocketed. There are more people living in poverty today than there were a generation ago. And those in the middle, they're finding they have fewer chances to succeed, to get ahead, and they're worrying about whether their children will have such chances. Now, all of these problems are exacerbated by barriers of discrimination and racism that hold people back and lead to one of the most segregated regions in the country. Now, we know when it becomes too expensive to live here, talented people vote with their feet. They have to, so they move somewhere more affordable. That's just one of the many reasons why we need to expand access to good-paying jobs. We can start by improving and expanding training and apprenticeship programs to help people without college degrees get higher-paying jobs, to make it easier for people who do want to go to college to pursue that dream. And I have fought for early childhood education for families and children throughout my adult life. And I was very, very proud that under Mayor de Blasio's leadership, New York City is leading the nation by extending free preschool to 3-year-olds. That will help tens of thousands of families. It won't only help them in terms of being able to work as well as not worry about their children. It will help them because their children will be better prepared for school from all backgrounds, and then they maybe can feel more secure about where the future possibly can lead for their own kids. I was also thrilled when Governor Cuomo announced the Excelsior Scholarship, which will help put debt-free college within reach for more New Yorkers. These two ideas, dealing with our youngest kids, getting them better prepared for school, and opening the doors of college to more middle-class and working kids, are exactly what we need to do if we're serious about creating this inclusive economy that has broadly shared prosperity. We should also expand support for small businesses by expanding access to capital and new markets, cutting taxes and red tape. And we need to create new incentives to attract and support manufacturing jobs, the way we've done in places like Buffalo and Rochester, and invest in regional job centers and smaller cities and downtowns so that the prosperity of our region, whether you're in New York or Newark, Stamford or New Haven, can be more inclusive. I think the New York region has always been and still is one of the world's greatest places to live. And it has a proud tradition of making sure people from all backgrounds could afford to live here. But today it's become the epicenter of the housing affordability crisis that we are facing across the region. As the fourth regional plan suggests, making housing more affordable means encouraging local land use and zoning strategies that make it easier to build affordable rental units near good jobs, schools, and transit. Connecticut, which has such strong transit connections, is well positioned to lead in this area by adding more density near Metro North stations. At the same time, as you note from the plan, we need to protect low-income residents from displacement. So as we are looking to increase our housing supply, we do have to strengthen and enforce fair housing laws and make sure we're building affordable housing options in communities across the region. And yes, we should provide more resources to public housing authorities like NYCHA and pair these investments with broader economic development efforts. Mayor de Blasio has taken a major step forward in this effort by launching a program that is on track to build and protect 300,000 affordable homes by 2022. And we need to make that a commitment that we follow through on. Another big idea that will help link communities to good jobs, promote opportunity, make our region more resilient is rebuilding our infrastructure. It is past time to repair and modernize our roads, bridges, tunnels, ports, airports, and broadband networks. Here in the tri-state region, our transportation system is the backbone of our economy. Our region is home to three of the busiest commuter rail systems in the country, obviously New Jersey Transit, Metro North, the Long Island Railroad, but funding for these systems has not kept up with the demand. And meanwhile, our subway system is in crisis. In fact, according to one survey last year, nearly 3/4 of New Yorkers said they'd been late to a work meeting because of a subway delay. Some lost wages as a result. Others were fired. So Governor Cuomo was right to declare a state of emergency, but now we have to act. And there are things we can do quickly and relatively inexpensively to solve some of our transportation challenges, like redesigning streets to accommodate walking, biking, and buses, as well as light rail and streetcars. But we also need new, large-scale investments to modernize our subways and our rail networks and upgrade our airports and seaports. The Second Avenue subway has been a transformative project. It was decades in the making. I was proud to work alongside some of you as a U.S. Senator to secure major federal investments. And having the first phase done is a significant milestone. Now the MTA, the state, the region need to consider ways to fast-track the final segment through private finance and performance-based delivery so that taxpayers don't have to wait another decade to see it completed. Now, as you know, I'm a Democrat, and I believe in government that works. But government that works doesn't always mean government that costs more. As we make these necessary investments, local leaders will need to make difficult decisions. We should keep in mind the steps the RPA has explored to ensure that public dollars are spent wisely, costs are streamlined, and public infrastructure agencies are more transparent, accountable, and efficient. To that end, our public agencies often assume risks they have no control over, such as schedule and cost overruns. Why not shift these risks to the private sector for our trickiest, most complicated projects? and then we can hold them accountable for delivering projects on budget and on time. The East Side Access will be a historic project when it's complete. But New Yorkers are shouldering a major cost for this project at $3.5 billion for 1 mile of rail track, 7 times the average elsewhere in the world. We need to motivate a performance-based approach to delivering on our infrastructure needs, and to think creatively about the infrastructure and transportation systems of tomorrow. I was excited to read the RPA's recommendation for helping our streets and highways, our real estate, and our infrastructure adapt to a technology-driven future. Integrating these new technologies into the physical fabric of urban life will help us to address some of the challenges we face. But we need to make sure that technology complements and works equitably for people rather than making their livelihoods and their work less secure. We've seen what's possible when we come together and take bold steps. The redevelopment of LaGuardia Airport's Central Terminal is a monumental project, and we will look to the leadership by the Port Authority for that. The MEGA project, which is the largest public-private partnership ever undertaken in our country, harnessed private investment to ensure these overdue improvements. Like all of you, it's embarrassing to land in our airports, isn't it? You go into airports around the world in old countries and newly developing countries, and it's hard to believe that we've neglected our airports the way we have. We're not even in the top 25 in the world anymore. So these improvements through this public-private partnership should produce results sooner. Now, New York and New Jersey have not yet adopted state legislation enabling public-private partnerships, and my hope is that the work being undertaken by the Port Authority will help catalyze support for that at the state and local level. Over 38 states have adopted such legislation, and I think New Jersey and New York need to provide cities with more tools to deliver projects. In Connecticut, strengthening existing legislation would open the door for more innovative projects, like replacing the Waterbury Mixmaster on I-84 and the viaduct in Hartford. And speaking of big ideas that can't wait, it's estimated that 10% of our country's entire gross domestic product depends on transit between New York and New Jersey. Yet we depend, for that 10%, on 2 100-year-old tunnels to carry millions of people to and from Manhattan. As a U.S. Senator, I worked on an earlier iteration of this project with my colleagues and with some of you, and we were able to reach an agreement between the federal government and New York and New Jersey at the end of the last administration. But the current administration refuses to honor that agreement. Now, I know that New York and New Jersey's governors and congressional delegations are doing everything they can to move this project forward, but they can't do this alone. I would argue that Gateway is our country's most critical infrastructure project. If our existing rail tunnels under the Hudson River fail, our region will become completely paralyzed and cut off. And the economic consequences will reverberate not just across this region, but across the country and the world. Not acting on the Gateway Tunnel is a disaster in itself waiting to happen. And it's time for the Trump administration to stop using this vital project to settle petty political scores. This is a moment for the RPA, the state, the industry. Indeed, the entire business community to come together to speak up for this project. I would urge anyone who has any contacts in the current administration, including in the Oval Office, to make this case, because this is so far beyond politics and partisanship. And yet, if you don't make the case, and especially people who have those relationships with members of the administration, aren't there really pushing for this, it could very well not happen, despite the overwhelming need for it. And the last big idea I will talk about is making our region a leader when it comes to clean energy and confronting the urgent challenge of climate change. Now, this is something that the people in this room know about all too well. We've witnessed firsthand the impact of heat waves, superstorms, natural disasters like Superstorm Sandy and Hurricane Irene. But think of this. Sea levels in the New York area are already a foot higher than they were in 1990. And the rate of sea level rise is increasing. New York is one of the most vulnerable cities when it comes to climate change. Twice as vulnerable as the next city. And we've done next to nothing to change that. You know, after Hurricane Katrina devastated the Gulf Coast, one of my then colleagues, Senator Landrieu, came to see me to ask for my help in getting support for the recovery and rebuilding, because she knew of the work I had done on our recovery and rebuilding after 9/11. And she came into my office and she brought a copy of the National Geographic magazine. It was a couple years old, but it had some maps. And she said, you know, I'm coming to ask for your help, but I also want to point out to you that your help is necessary, not just politically, but in terms of confronting climate change, because if you look at these National Geographic map projections, New York and Long Island are two of the areas most vulnerable. And I remember taking that map and looking at it. Of course, Miami was on the map, and you know, Hampton Roads was on the map, but it was very clear that New York, right here at home, was in the, the pathway of not only more storms. We now believe some of those storms are exacerbated by climate change, but that just with the natural progression of rising sea levels baked into our infrastructure needs, we needed to pay attention. So RPA is so right in looking at both resilience and reducing emissions. And I want to just emphasize that. We're kind of up against some pretty big obstacles about reducing emissions, although states and cities and businesses are really continuing, despite our having been withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, the only country in the world now left not in the Paris Agreement. So we still need to focus on that, but we've got to pay attention to resilience, to protect communities along the coast from storms and flooding where we can, and transition away from places that can't be protected. And at the same time, we need to build and upgrade our infrastructure so that it truly is resilient. We've taken some steps, but not near enough. Fortunately, there is one area where we don't need to wait for the federal government to act, because as RPA suggests, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut can strengthen and expand the existing carbon pricing system, similar to the way California has done, to help reach a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2040. And I really applauded Governor Murphy for his announcement that New Jersey would be rejoining the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And if we can get this moving again, which I believe under the leadership of our three states we can, then we can see results. But we also have to be looking at many other alternative steps to take. And by the way, when we talk about creating more resilient infrastructure, that includes water infrastructure. You know, as a senator, I worked with public health experts to raise awareness of the dangers of lead in pipes in New York. And as a presidential candidate, I saw firsthand the heartbreak and devastation in Flint, Michigan. You know, clean air and clean water cannot be considered luxuries. They have to be viewed as basic rights for all Americans. Everyone deserves a chance to live a safe, healthy life, no matter who you are or where you live. And so we have to look to our cities and our states and our regions to try to lead at this time. But we can't do everything that needs to be done alone. We need a state and federal government that will support us and work with us. Now, National Infrastructure Week is right around the corner, although sometimes it seems whenever there are bad headlines coming out of Washington, it's always around the corner. And there's always talk about it, but so far, little to no action. And unfortunately, we aren't expecting Congress to pass major legislation, which I think is such a lost opportunity. So we have to get creative. We have to develop new methods to finance major infrastructure programs. In Los Angeles, the city passed a Measure M program with overwhelming voter support to add a new sales tax to fund more than $120 billion available for investment. New York and New Jersey, Connecticut could do the same. The one thing we cannot afford to do is nothing. So we need real solutions and a long-term, thoughtful plan like that produced by RPA. And while Washington is unlikely to help us do any of these things right now, eventually, maybe we will have the opportunity to legislate again, to look for big ideas, and to take this period of time where the states are the laboratories for democracy and the cities are doing the same, to come up with some solutions that then we can take to the national level. As you can probably tell by now, I really do love talking about this stuff. I can't help it. You know, I'm always criticized for caring about policy, and you know, I actually do plead to that charge because I think it matters. I think it matters whether your kids have good schools, whether you can have access to quality, affordable health care, whether the communities you live in are thinking more about the future than arguing about the past. So we do need to think big and think different. And we have to generate a sense of urgency and passion around our ideas for the future, starting with the 61 recommendations in the 4th Regional Plan. And obviously, we have to do more than just talk about these ideas. We need to try to form coalitions to help implement them. That's why the RPA is important and why I was very honored to be asked to come and speak today, because it is about planning for the future. And even though I know everyone here in this room is already working on that, we've got to get that sense of urgency to motivate us to do even more, to offer those bold, creative ideas that will provide broad-based benefits for the entire region. And yes, we have to think outside the box. We have to scour the world looking for ideas that we can perhaps borrow, steal, adapt, bringing them home and trying them out here. As is written in the plan, the biggest challenges we face are not the result of external forces or situations beyond our control. It is the constraints that we put on ourselves and our institutions. If you think about New York infrastructure history, it's really quite remarkable. Going all the way back to the early part of the 19th century when far-sighted people said, you know, we need to plan a water system that will serve the city as it grows. So we should get legislation that allows us to control areas upstate to keep that water as pure as possible and then build this system to bring it down so that when people turn on a faucet, they will have good, clean drinking water. And as we all know, oftentimes in contests, New York water is judged the best public water in the country, even has won some world prizes. But it was groups of people who thought about that. On the national level, I'm always struck by Abraham Lincoln in the middle of fighting a civil war to save our country, and yes, indeed, that's what it was about. He found the time to buttonhole and convince business leaders to take the risk to build a transcontinental railroad. He also came up with the idea of land-grant colleges. So even while the future of the Union was not secure, he was planning for the future he hoped we would have. And just look at some of the great infrastructure right here in this region. It was built and funded in the middle of the Great Depression. And then after World War II, we had another burst of energy where people thought, hey, we got a plan for the future. We've got to make investments now that will pay off in years to come. And of course, closer to home, none of us who lived through 9/11 and its aftermath will ever forget the lives we lost, Lower Manhattan in ruins, toxic dust and debris raining down on us, and the many examples of heroism we saw. The construction workers, the emergency personnel who raced to the site and spent long hours on that smoldering pile searching for survivors, and then months more clearing the site. The everyday citizens who lined up to donate blood, they projected a sense of strength and unity that spoke to our whole country. And as the dust settled, New Yorkers rolled up their sleeves and got to work. And New York wanted to rebuild. You know, I was there the day after 9/11 with Chuck Schumer. Yes, I was there, despite what some say. There are even pictures that prove it. But in a fact-free universe, sometimes those don't work either. So I remember looking at that black screen that covered the area and seeing firefighters break through that cloud, some of them dragging their axes, totally exhausted after having spent 30-plus hours looking for their friends, their colleagues. And we went to a big meeting that night. It was all the local, state, federal people. And Chuck and I were in the meeting, and around 9 o'clock, our staff came in and whispered to both of us, the White House has sent up a request for appropriations for funding for $20 billion, and it does not include 1 penny for New York. Well, you can imagine how shocked and dismayed we were. And so Chuck was going home to see his family. He'd been worried about them for more than a day. And I ran to get the last train to Washington in order to get to the Congress as early as I could in the morning. And we were able to work together to fight to get that funding. And I remember so well being at the door of then Senator Robert Byrd, who chaired the Appropriations Committee, at 6 o'clock in the morning. And I told him what I'd seen, and I told him how devastated the city was. And we had no idea yet how much loss of life there had been, but businesses as well as the towers had been obliterated. So he said, well, what do you need? I said, well, we need $20 billion. I figured if the rest of the country was getting $20 billion, we should get $20 billion. And he looked at me and he said, consider me the third senator from New York. And so Chuck and I had to get creative because clearly there wasn't a lot of attention being paid to New York's needs from the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. And the next day, we went to the White House. And in the Oval Office, it was just the 2 senators from Virginia, Chuck and myself, with the president and 1 or 2 of his aides. And I looked at President Bush, and I could just see in his eyes what an awesome, daunting, impossible challenge had been imposed upon him as our president. And he asked us what we needed. And I said, we need $20 billion for New York, Mr. President. And he said, you got it. And people ask me, well, you know, you're a Democrat, he's a Republican. What do you think? I said, well, there are a lot of things that I disagreed with him on, but I'll tell you this. From that moment in the Oval Office until money was delivered, he never wavered, despite enormous political pressure from within his own party. Because by the time that by the time Chuck and I got back to Capitol Hill, you know, the knives were already out. I just have to underscore the need for persistence in the face of opposition, and that goes as much for what we face today as it did back then. And we know what we can accomplish when we put people ahead of politics, when we work together to deliver results. So in the weeks and months ahead, I hope that every one of us will find ways to work together to maximize these ideas and to think about how we can deliver on them locally, through the state, and yes, through the federal government. I'll certainly do everything I can to be supportive, but we need you to keep amplifying your voices, not only here at City Hall, but in Albany, in Trenton, in Hartford, across this region, and yes, in Washington. Do everything you can to focus the nation's attention, this administration, and members of Congress on why what we need here in this region is not just about New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. We are among the engines of the entire economy of America. So anything that goes wrong here, that slows us down, that interferes with growth and development, has a ripple effect. So please join together in making sure that the ideas that the RPA has presented are actually given an audience, and more than that, acted on. And then we can see the kind of future that we deserve for this region. Thank you all very much.
Okay, that concludes our luncheon program. Thank you, everybody, for joining us here today. Thank you so much, Secretary Clinton, Howard Milstein, Tony Kosha, Scott Reckler, and all of our speakers today. That was really an extraordinary day. I want to remind everybody that we have 4 breakout sessions now on integrating and expanding our commuter rail network, investing in our region's flagship places, instituting and funding a regional coastal commission, and giving our communities the tools they need to plan for the future. I hope you'll stick around for the entire day. And so as a special enticement for our closing reception, we'll be joined in the foyer by Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, who will give some brief remarks before a final opportunity to mingle with the other incredible attendees here today. Finally, thank you to all of the speakers, sponsors, and board members who made this possible. Thank you so much.